I'm a big fan of Jesus of Nazareth, the one that's depicted in the Gospel of Thomas. Unfortunately, that Gospel was suppressed by the Church, even though there's quite a bit of evidence that it's even earlier than the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. If you care to do a bit of skeptical research, you can find plenty of evidence that the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, are unreliable. Of course, their unreliability only shows that these books were written by human beings with all their flaws. It doesn't necessarily prove anything about the central claim of Christianity. Personally, you'll hear other people say different things, but I personally have very little doubt that there was actually some guy called Jesus, and at about 2,000 years ago he preached a message that bewildered some people, inspired others, and troubled the authorities enough that they killed him. I do, however, doubt that Jesus was the Christ that the Church depicted him to be. Now, why do I doubt this? Why do I doubt this? Because that depiction doesn't even make any sense. The theory that we're asked to accept goes something like this. 1. There was original sin, such as the story, or as told in the story of Adam and Eve. And number 2, to redeem humanity from original sin, Jesus was sent to earth as a sacrifice. That's Christianity in a nutshell. And so far, I think any Christian will say, yeah, that's how it goes. But let's look at the implicit assumption that hides inside this theory. 3, this sacrifice of Jesus was the only, or the best, way to redeem humanity from original sin. If there was an alternative to God having someone tortured to death, wouldn't it make sense for God to use that alternative? I realize that some people will now be thinking something along these lines. What makes sense to God doesn't have to make sense to us. God's ways are higher than ours, that sort of thing. I consider this a specious argument. If you're saying my God's ways are too mysterious to understand, that works for any religion, no matter how ridiculous it is. As such, you can't really use it to discern between what is a reasonable and an unreasonable belief. It's a cop-out. Well, if, as Christianity says, God chose to torture his Son to death as a means to redeem us, it must mean that God had no choice in the matter. If he'd had a simpler, less violent, more loving choice, he would surely have done that. Some people now may say, but he did try an alternative with the chosen people, the Jews, the Hebrews, the Old Testament. Unfortunately, that argument's at odds with the Christian belief that God can foresee the future. There is one possible way around that complaint. You can say that the only thing that God was doing with the chosen people was demonstrating that that kind of approach wouldn't work. But that's really at odds with what he said to, for example, Abraham, unless you go through some complicated thing with saying, Jesus was descended from Abraham, which is questionable because Jesus was supposedly not born of Joseph, but was born without Joseph. It's kind of a legalistic thing that you're going through there. But let's get back to the central notion of Christianity, this idea that Jesus was to redeem us from original sin by being tortured to death. Well, as far as I can see, this leaves us with only one possible conclusion to the theory as stated, and this is number 4. God had no other way to redeem humanity except this human sacrifice thing. If that's so, the question arises, redeem them from what? In other words, who made these rules? Who set up reality in such a way that God would be cornered into making such an unpleasant decision? In other words, who forced God to torture his own son to death? If God set up the rules to reality, he could do whatever he pleased, including forgiving humanity for the original sin. Since he's omnipotent, so they say, he could simply say the words, "I forgive you." Problem solved, right? Of course, some people listening into this will now say, no, that's wrong. And then they'll go into some complicated, convoluted argument about the nature of free will. But these arguments don't really answer the problem that I've raised so far. Which is, if you want to boil it down, if God didn't have a less barbaric choice than torturing somebody to death, why didn't he have a choice? There's a limit to how clear I can make this. Either you understand what I'm saying by now or you don't. And if you do understand, you might be wondering what actually happened 2,000 years ago. Well, I wasn't there, obviously, so I can't tell you. I don't have videotapes of Jesus' life. But this is what I think happened. Jesus was a preacher. He had a highly original message. His followers didn't understand what he was saying. So they made up various stories that proved that their version of what he was saying was in fact what he was saying. In other words, they were human, and they behaved the way people have throughout history. As a result of this, the doctrines of the Christian religions have almost nothing to do with what Jesus actually said. Is that so hard to believe?